SheTalksGreen, the podcast where we break down big ideas in climate, clean energy, and sustainability with experts who are shaping the future. Today, I am joined by Hisham Mundol, Chief Advisor for India at the Environmental Defence Fund. With over 25 years of experience in climate strategy and sustainable development, he'll help us break down the opportunities, challenges, and future of green hydrogen in India.
Arpita, it's a total pleasure. I just want to make an unscripted pitch for SheTalksGreen. I think it's an excellently produced and researched resource. So very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Hisham, for your kind words. I think we'll dive in, head on. What is green hydrogen? Green hydrogen has taken center stage in the global energy transition debate. India is actively promoting it to reduce carbon emissions in critical industries, aiming for net zero emissions by 2070. Can you help us understand what makes green hydrogen unique? How is it produced using renewable energy, and what key benefits does it offer for India's energy security?
Sure. So maybe let me start with the various colors of hydrogen, because for a change, I think the climate community has not come up with a jargon-intensive way of classification, but something which one can understand. And we've gone a little overboard, and now we have more than the full rainbow. So hydrogen is essentially a potential fuel. Where you get it from is how it gets classified. Green hydrogen is when you take water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen using renewable sources. And that's the essential part. As you would have gathered from this, the emissions are, significantly lower, and the costs could be significantly advantageous. That's the green hydrogen part. Let me just quickly go through the others without going through too much technical detail. But the blue hydrogen is when you get it from predominantly coal sources. There's a process called gasification, and there is a component of carbon capture. So the residual carbon dioxide gets captured. Gray hydrogen is mostly from natural gas sources without the carbon capture part of it. Brown and black are again mostly from fossil fuels without the carbon capture component. As you would have gathered, wherever there isn't carbon capture component, the emission story isn't particularly attractive. Then we come into the more exotic colors. So there's pink that comes from nuclear energy. There's yellow, which is hydrogen from solar energy. There's white, which is naturally occurring hydrogen reserves that are there. And then my favorite, because I actually don't know what the color turquoise is turquoise hydrogen, which is when you split methane into the component parts of hydrogen and solid carbon. In all of this spectrum of colors, green hydrogen is by far the most emissions friendly that way, and that's the reason why the government of India, and indeed many other governments and private sector organizations, are looking at it as ambitiously as they are. What is the role? The other question you asked is, what is the role for hydrogen in India's energy security? Over the next decade, and hopefully for every decade after that, India's economy is going to double in size. We need that kind of growth to lift more people out of poverty, to lift living standards for the middle class. That growth is going to come from industry and infrastructure. Industry and infrastructure require energy. And so there is a dramatic increase in the energy requirements that India is going to have. And the question that India asks itself is, where are we going to get this energy from? Do we, take it all from traditional sources, which we know are more emissions intensive and are, significantly responsible for climate change? and also are sources which we don't naturally have in adequate measure in India. And so you have to import it. There's an import bill component. There's geopolitics that comes in terms of where you're able to source this from. Um, any future model for any country, quite frankly, one of the key tenets is to have diversity in your energy mix. I think it's safe to say that it's foolhardy to make a bet on only one energy source. So have that diversity in your mix, and over a period of time, and the constant ambition is to make that period of time as less as possible, have lower emission sources, more renewable sources that come in. The role of hydrogen is essential where you need green hydrogen in this case, where you need high energy sources. So a big steel plant or a fertilizer plant or an aluminum plant, they need high energy sources which are not always deliverable through renewable energy provisioning. And also there are some challenges on solar, for example. It's available when only when the sun is there. So that's the role for hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen.
Right. I think you truly said that there's a whole bunch of rainbow colors available to us. Now, just focusing a little bit on that, you mentioned that green hydrogen is basically our cleanest option to go for. How are we faring against that when it comes to industrial use? Because despite its promises, green hydrogen is facing major roadblocks, whether it is cost, production, technology. And what I understand is that gray hydrogen still remains a little dominant due to its lower cost. So, what technological innovations and economic strategies are being explored to bridge this cost gap and achieve commercial viability?
Sure, and you're right. Gray hydrogen is the predominant source in the world and in India right now. So, what are the barriers to the use of more green hydrogen? The first is more supply of green hydrogen, and the second is to bring down the costs. The costs right now are roughly $4 to $5 a kilo. They need to come down to $1.5 a kilo for them for it to start becoming commercially viable. Uh, what are the inputs into why the cost is what it is? The process is an electrolysis process. We don't have to get into what that is, but the raw materials in that sense are renewable energy and water. Renewable energy costs are one of the most competitive in India compared to any other countries. So that's a really positive sign for India in terms of making a big bet on green hydrogen. The other question is going to be the cost of electrolyzers, and if there's any other, transformative engineering process to split the water. On those fronts, what the government's done is they are incentivizing domestic manufacture of electrolyzers, which will certainly be a help and a good start. But you do need Indian industry and Indian government to partner more on how do you bring down the costs uh, even more dramatically than just the domestic manufacturing part, which is an important part, but is not a sufficient part for the overall mix. The other thing that the government has done is put in what I would classify as loose mandates for some industries to use more green hydrogen. 10% of their fuel, of their energy input costs for the fertilizer sector is supposed to be through green hydrogen. I think working closely with industry to make sure that these numbers are actually met is another uh, area where attention will still need to be paid, because you don't want the target to just be a loose target that we only report back that we didn't achieve. So I think those are important initiatives that need to be taken to advance hydrogen. One other aspect that I'll mention is, where is the technology going to come for bringing down the cost from $4 a kilo to one and a half. I think it is essential for India to build that technology homegrown. We know what it means to be dependent on imported fossil fuels. The last thing India should do is to add to that imported fossil fuel dependency a new range of dependencies on imported climate technologies, such as bringing down the cost of green hydrogen. It's not an easy thing to propose or effect. The reality is that we don't spend enough on R&D as a country. We need to spend much more on R&D. The private sector needs to spend much more. You need much deeper collaborations between Indian industry, government, and research and academia and the startup community to work on really these big, tough problems, in climate technology and indeed other technologies. The good thing is there is an example that we already have in front of us, which is the fintech revolution, right? You've seen how that's transformed India, and so much of it is homegrown solutions and homegrown technologies. We need that on broader R&D, and particularly climate technology, and specific to our conversation today, green hydrogen.
Absolutely. I think R&D certainly is an area where we need more and more focus for scaling up some of these technologies. While green hydrogen is a promising solution, it is not the only path to decarbonization. There are competing technologies like battery energy storage, carbon capture, and direct electrification of industrial processes, which are advancing very rapidly. Now, given the cost and infrastructure challenges, where should India prioritize green hydrogen over other alternatives? And what role does it play in a broader clean energy transition strategy?
And the emphasis is the broader clean energy transition strategy. And the reason I say this is that when you look at climate change, it is truly the most, difficult and pressing challenge faced by humanity. The solutions for it are also the most complex and expensive undertaking that humanity will has ever been called on to do. The hard reality is that there are no silver bullets. There isn't that one thing that if you just did that, it would fix the problem. One of the issues with hydrogen is that it looks so seductively attractive that sometimes the narrative is this thing will come and solve all our problems. As I said, no one thing is going to come and solve our problems. There's a whole host of things that we need to do. You mentioned things like storage. Absolutely, we need to do more investments in energy storage so that you have a more stable energy supply. There's more that needs to be done on the renewables generation side. Well, there's amazing progress. India is a shining star in the world on how it's ramped up renewables. We just crossed 200 gigawatts of capacity. But how much of that 200 gigawatts of capacity is actually being utilized in the grid, and where are the bottlenecks that are slowing it, and how do you remove those bottlenecks is one aspect. Solar certainly very interesting, but you can't bank only on solar. The government's looking at accelerating nuclear, which is great. The government's also wanting to do more on wind, particularly offshore wind. Right now, the cost structures aren't as attractive, and those need to be addressed. Even on solar, sometimes we as NGOs sometimes make that mistake where you calculate what is India's energy requirement and say, okay, this converts into only 0.0x% of land in some state, and we could fix the whole problem with just this much land. Somebody lives on that land. There's land acquisition challenges. The cost of capital remains a problem even for renewable energy generators. So we need to look at that entire broad spectrum is what I would say. Green hydrogen is one part of it. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't have, the words of caution that will go with it, and I'm sure we'll come to today. But yeah, it is an important part of a mix.
No, I think you rightly mentioned that the key is the broader clean energy transition strategy. Uh, no one solution is going to fix the entire problem. Now, while we are making progress and we are looking at the supply side challenges more closely, large scale adoption of green hydrogen depends on demand creation as well. So, what are the key barriers preventing industries also to switch from fossil fuels to hydrogen? Is it just cost, or there is also a room for stronger policy mandates and other supply chain, coordinations that we should be looking at?
Sure. So a really big driver is certainly cost at this point in time. I'm reasonably confident that with enough attention, both of government as well as the private sector, we will be able to bring down the costs relatively soon. So that will certainly remove one big constraining factor. There is a certain amount of cost that a factory will undertake in terms of re-engineering for it to be able to use hydrogen. I think that is something that the private sector or whoever is running the factory can relatively easily absorb, because the payback is so much is so strong. On the supply chain front of it, there is a question on where is it currently available, and you'll notice from reading in the newspapers that Reliance and the Adani Group are both investing big in green hydrogen, and they're not the only ones. There's a host of others that are investing. That will hopefully bring in more supply in the market. I think some other things which you don't normally think of as direct policy levers. So, for example, the Indian carbon market, when it gets launched, will provide that additional incentive for lower emission manufacturing, and that will then act as a nudge to use cheaper fuels, whether it's directly renewables or green hydrogen. So, a number of these things will need to come together. There's one aspect, I know we're talking about supply, demand, but there's one aspect on the supply which I just want to touch on for a moment. One of the principles that we should follow when we're looking at green hydrogen is it has to be incremental in terms of our emission reduction story. The last thing you want to do with green hydrogen is take existing capacity for renewables and divert it to green hydrogen manufacturing. You want incremental capacity on renewables. So, you pointed out in the introduction that India's ambition is to make 5 million metric tons of hydrogen. That's going to require 125 gigawatts of capacity. Very, very encouragingly, what the national policy states is that this 125 gigawatts is going to be incremental, and that's really essential. The last thing you want to do is divert. And on the just coming back to the demand side, it's also trying to figure out where are the best places that you would want to use green hydrogen. And there's really a very simple principle, which is if you can electrify it, chances are you're better off electrifying it rather than using electricity from a renewable source to split water and then produce green hydrogen. Who determines this? Thermodynamics. 80% of energy from electricity goes into movement if you're looking at an electric vehicle. The number is closer to 20% when you look at traditional petrol or diesel vehicles. So wherever you can directly electrify, you should be looking at direct electrification, because the electrolysis process that converts water into hydrogen does take energy, has energy requirements, and therefore you need to do a calculation of saying net which works out better. Where you need a high energy source that is difficult to power with electricity, or the costs of re-engineering that plant to be able to use electricity are so high that they become uncompetitive, chances are you're not chances are you should be using green hydrogen there. Where you can use electricity, you should be using renewable electricity directly.
I mean, certainly, mobility is one key focus area when we speak of green hydrogen. And I mentioned it that, even in the India Energy Week, we've seen, how we showcased the hydrogen fueled bus ferrying around key dignitaries from different countries, our ministers. So certainly that focus is there. Now that brings me to a very key aspect of hydrogen when we talk about it is the public apprehension around hydrogen safety. Now, there have been concerns fueled by some historical incidents like the Hindenburg disaster and a few more recent events here and there in different parts of the world. While these incidents are rare, they shape perception. And honestly, it doesn't help if key leaders keep bringing this up in that light. So, can you help us understand how current safety standards, engineering measures, and real world data addresses these concerns? And are hydrogen vehicles truly as safe as or safer than the traditional fuels or the electric vehicles that we are focusing so much on?
Sure, and it's a very valid concern. When you hear of one story of an accident that happens. It's not unique to hydrogen. When CNG vehicles came in, everyone was not everyone, but there were enough people who were worried about sitting in an auto with a gas cylinder under you, bumping around a street. There were stories about, and even now there are some instances of fires from electric vehicles. For the most part, wherever there is a gas-based fuel, there is enough safety measures in place to make it not a 0% chance, but such a low chance that it can be reasonably classified as safe for public use. That is on the risk of the explosion part if the hydrogen leaks out. It does require people to be honest and thoughtful. So the one thing that the hydrogen community, if I can call them that, shouldn't do is gloss over where there are instances. You should immediately investigate them. You should, be transparent with the public about what happened. And I'm not just talking India, I'm talking globally. And you should have a solution in place that you can declare to the public honestly and confidently that you have put in place. Remember, when we had LPG cylinders, there were cases of LPG cylinders also causing accidents. Those are much fewer and far in between. What I would also urge is, if there is a community out there that doesn't believe in hydrogen for whatever reason, again, if you are bringing out a narrative, keep it fact-based and evidence-grounded. Scaremongering is rarely likely to help, and you lose credibility after some time. That is just on the safety part of it. There is another question on safety, which is more from the environment side. I'm going to take you back to high school chemistry when they taught us that hydrogen was amongst the smallest molecules. And so there is, if you are the smallest molecule, there is a higher risk of leakage. And you need to make sure that you have the right monitoring mechanisms in place to check what is the level of leakage. And you quite likely will need to make engineering fixes to make sure that the pipelines that you have in your factories, etc., the valves and gaskets, etc., do not allow for hydrogen leakage. Why is this important? If hydrogen leaks, the effect that it has is not necessarily just the explosion. but it could also significantly contribute to rising temperatures because it reacts in the environment, and it catalyzes the process, catalyzes additional methane production, additional ozone production, additional even water production, and all of these absorb more heat. That's one. Hydrogen on its own absorbs more heat than carbon dioxide. So you want to minimize the leakages of hydrogen. Part of where that then takes you is you also want to minimize the amount of distance that you're transporting hydrogen, because it just increases the risks of leakages. I think one area where not all policymakers across the world have paid adequate attention to is the question of monitoring and leakages, and optimizing the transport network. So some countries, for example, are looking at green hydrogen hubs where you minimize the distance between where your solar energy or your renewable energy is generated, where the production of green hydrogen is done, and where the end source is. Part of the logic for that is not just cost, although there's an obvious cost advantage, but it is also to minimize transporting of hydrogen. So there's two aspects of it. I think realistically, the explosive accident thing is much more of a question that is readily fixed or already fixed. The one about the environmental impact is one which still needs to be looked at. Now, this is not to say that a country like India should not look at green hydrogen. India should absolutely be looking at it, but have these guardrails, and then within these guardrails, expand your ambitions.
Right. So, beyond the engineering solutions, do you think that we are doing enough to educate the public as well about hydrogen, its safety, its uses? Because I feel there is a lot of room there, and that's not, in my opinion, only for hydrogen, but every energy solution that we are exploring today. We need more focus on public campaigning and really educating them instead of creating different narratives which doesn't even reach them.
You're absolutely right on the broader point. What we've tended to do is play catch up with the public. So you come up with a new technology, it starts getting rolled out. Some people in the public know a little bit about it, and then something happens down the line, and then everyone says, "Oh, oops, we didn't talk about exploding electric vehicles." Now, let's take the example of exploding electric vehicles. The percentage of vehicles that are catching fire is tiny, is really, really tiny. Um, Imagine if we had spent the time and effort and resource to educate the public about the safety features of it well in advance. So we absolutely should do that. We should do that. We should have done it for electric vehicles. We still can need to do it for electric vehicles. We do need to do it on green hydrogen, and any other new source that comes in mind. Um, One area where the imperative for green hydrogen might not be as much in terms of public education is if you take the underlying principle of using electricity when you can and not use green hydrogen, not transporting it, and monitoring leakages. What that results in is saying, I will concentrate the use of green hydrogen in mostly industrial applications. So, the big steel, fertilizer, chemicals, aluminium plant. Unlike an electric vehicle where you want lakhs and crores of people to be using it, so there might not be as much requirement as long as we meet, if we follow these principles. But your point is well taken. Wherever there is a new technology, you absolutely should invest the time in advance with the public and do that persistently, so that the message lands. And you need to do that authentically and credibly. The last thing you want to do is say, hey, this is an amazing solution, it has no downsides, it's perfect, it's wonderful. No, it's not that.
Absolutely. I think that is another area and another learning, perhaps, that while we make progress on scaling up these promising technologies, there has to be a lot of emphasis and focus on public education as well to be truly successful in our transition to clean energy solutions. Now I'll come down to focus more on the regulatory and other challenges that we were touching upon when we started this conversation. One of the key challenges for green hydrogen in India is water availability. So, producing 1 kg of hydrogen perhaps requires 9 to 10 liters of purified water. In water stressed states like Rajasthan and Gujarat, there is a risk that hydrogen production competes with essential water needs. Do we have a solution to address this challenge? I've read about, there is desalinization, water waste treatment, other circular economy strategies that can perhaps mitigate this challenge. How is India addressing these risks? Or how we have created a plan so that we are able to attract investments and ensure that projects stay on track while we we also not let these technologies affect the public with respect to these daily essential needs.
Sure. And that's a really good question because I know that that is something which is often asked by anyone who starts hearing about green or learning about green hydrogen. If you look at a national level, the amount of water that is required for us to meet these ambitions that India has set is about 0.07% of our water requirements. Now, that sounds really low, and at a national level, it is really low. However, as you rightly pointed out, the question is never what is it at a national level, but what is it at a state or a district level. And you called out, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, for example, is another state that has considerable water concerns. When we're looking at green hydrogen, you absolutely have to look at the concentrations. The green hydrogen hub strategy, for example, must look at what is available in that region. The last thing you want to do is to divert agricultural groundwater or public drinking groundwater for this, because we know that both of them, both those requirements are massive, and we are looking down the barrel at groundwater shortages. And we're not just looking down the barrel. In many districts, there are, it's a clear and present crisis.
I think we have already reached there. We are hearing stories where districts, cities have gone without water for many days.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And so I think one area which we should pay as much, so it's great that we're paying attention to the production, the manufacturing of the electrolyzers. Part of the R&D effort that I'm hoping, companies are investing in is to bring down the cost. But the other question is going to be on water. And you're right, desalination plants is certainly one route that's there, and is something that other countries have factored into their hydrogen strategies. Another one is on circularity. Part of the R&D in terms of bringing down cost should also be to put a real price on water and find ways to either process, use recycled water of some kind, or treated water. That is part of the I'm hoping the innovation that comes from India, because the unique context of India on water is such that there are going to be very few countries that pay as much attention to it as India needs to, because of the challenges on water supply.
You mentioned that we should perhaps look at putting price on water. Wouldn't that discourage companies to further invest in this technology, because that would only add more cost. While I understand that it also brings that responsibility for them to not divert essential drinking water or agricultural water to just producing a certain kind of technology. But wouldn't that also kind of sway them away from this, because this makes it more expensive?
So there's two things to consider, and let me just move into a slightly philosophical zone. I would very rarely not bet against private sector innovation, and you know, with partnership with the government, etc., etc. Uh, I think there is so much more innovation that the private sector can do to bring down costs of the production of green hydrogen. Now, there's two ways that you can take the water question. One is, do you put an actual cost to it? In a sense, there is a cost, because it's not like a company can just take as much water as it wants to. In a more broader environmental sense, we have to find ways of pricing in water, carbon, and any other resource. When you're comparing, solar energy vis-a-vis coal, it's not just the cost of production, but there is a larger public health cost and there's an environmental damage cost. Solar is already more attractive, but it'll be even more attractive if the energy that comes from fossil fuels has a more accurate loading in of the cost that we are incurring on public health, on agricultural distress, and variations on overall warming. So putting a cost is something which will act as a near-term disincentive to companies, but will act as a massive incentive for innovation, because the folks who can crack it are the ones who are going to survive and thrive, in a 50-year horizon. The other thing which I can't imagine will not be done is constraint on how much water you can use. Somebody were to set up a green hydrogen plant in a groundwater distressed district. I don't think that they'd get approvals for it to begin with. And even if they got their approvals, I don't think the government would allow them, unbridled access to water. This, however, is what I'm thinking. Having it codified will be essential, because who cares what I think? It's finally what somebody does on the ground.
I'll come to some of the cool stuff that's happening in the hydrogen space. So we were talking about the infrastructure, production, storage, and particularly the use of hydrogen in transportation. Still evolving, but if I am correct that India's first hydrogen train was set to roll out, I think in this month, March, on the Jind Sonipat route in Haryana. And I think it's a significant milestone. Now, this is actually going to put India among a handful of countries alongside Germany, China, that have hydrogen powered trains, and it's in use. What role can such large scale projects play in mainstreaming hydrogen adoption? We've already spoken about R&D, investments, technology, focus on infrastructure, but we're also experimenting with some of these cool projects. So how do you see that helping us in the hydrogen case?
Let me use your terminology of cool projects. The cool projects, the green hydrogen train that you spoke about, the green hydrogen bus that was ferrying around folks in that conference, the green hydrogen car that you see every once in a while in the newspapers, they serve a purpose of introducing green hydrogen to the public and to policymakers and other stakeholders. It is difficult right now, purely from a thermodynamics view, to see where the big scale story would come on green hydrogen as a fuel for cars, for instance. There are perfectly viable electric vehicles. There is enough and more reasons to think that the cost of electric vehicles is progressively coming down. There's new technologies that are coming to remove the constraining factor of critical minerals in the source of in the battery manufacture. Again, because of thermodynamics, if 80% of the energy gets transported into distance in a car, it's likely to make more sense to just use the car directly. If you were to look at moving more, larger volumes through green hydrogen in terms of transport, it is essential that we do that monitoring and measuring of green hydrogen leakages that might exist, because you don't want to have that proliferation of numbers without knowing how much green hydrogen is leaking and what changes I need to make to the vehicle if I choose to use a vehicle to advance them. So I think they're very, very cool, and they are, they very attractive looking vehicles. They're very exciting, new energy source, always good. But the scale up story is a question mark. Again, where you might need a high energy source, like a ship that's traveling, across an ocean, there you could imagine that there could be the role for something, for green hydrogen to play in that, where just the sheer weight of batteries, if you're looking at electrifying it, would make the whole vessel unviable. So those are where you would see potential for it. In the other cases, I think it serves a useful but limited purpose of public awareness generation.
So, I have 2 points in my mind. One is that, like you rightly pointed out, that these school projects are merely a tool to just introduce the larger public that, okay, we are moving in this direction. Maybe we should actually add the whole component of public education as well while doing these school projects. So maybe we'll be able to get that attention and also seed in the right factual messaging that should be done. The second is that I understand is that for transportation, scaling up green hydrogen technology perhaps will take more time, more maturity of the sector itself. How about we focus more on the hard to abate industries where it is very difficult to decarbonize given their production value chain? Can we look into those areas more, because perhaps there is more opportunity there? And what suggestions you would give from a policy perspective and an overall sector perspective in focusing on these hard to abate sectors?
Sure. So the tougher to abate sectors like manufacturing, steel, aluminium, fertilizers is absolutely a sector where much more green hydrogen or other clean fuel sources can and should be looked at. This again, the starting point. If I'm running a steel plant, the first question I'm going to ask is, great, I understand the emissions story of green hydrogen, but look at my cost differential. Get me something which is competitive. As the prices go down, as R&D and costs bring prices down, there will be other things that come in that will make the trade-off clearer. So, for example, if I'm exporting steel, I know that a certain amount of premium is going to be placed on greener steel, not just exporting, but increasingly in the domestic market as well. That will help me do the calculation of, this is the actual cost to me with green hydrogen, this is the actual cost to me with a fossil fuel based solution. The Indian carbon market, as I mentioned earlier, will also play a role. And domestically, every company knows that for us to remain viable in the long run, you have to be not just competitive from a cost competitiveness point of view, but an emissions competitiveness point of view. And the great story about India is that emission competitiveness almost always results in cost competitiveness as well. So all of these factors are certainly drivers that will advance it for the tougher to abate sectors. What are the kind of specific policy interventions that need to be done? I think there's another additional aspect, which is the country's net zero commitment. For the net zero commitment to happen, it isn't just, the Prime Minister's office that needs to declare it. Every single ministry has adopted it. Industries know that they need to as well align. For this chain to happen, what you need to do is start looking at where are those tougher to abate sectors, under which ministries do they lie, and in which geographies do they predominantly exist. Find out how you can create those green hydrogen hubs, which will end up becoming green manufacturing hubs, because I imagine that they will be where you have relatively incremental, not incremental, and relatively easy to access renewables capacity, where you have the ability to set up a green hydrogen facility. Therefore, the point that you made earlier about water availability, and you have a demand in terms of the actual end source. Find out where these need to be done, and this is one of those linear programming models that you'll have to run and iterate to arrive at your best configuration. And then subsequently start looking at specific smaller industry groupings. And you need one of the companies to make that advance and create them as a center of excellence or learning that other companies can come and gain from. Oftentimes, companies, like human beings, I dare say, will follow the steer of their peers rather than the advice of an earnest not-for-profit or the diktat of a government mandate. You need the government mandate, you need the earnestness of the not-for-profit, but you also need to create peer groups that inspire or perspire competitors to jump on board. These changes have happened in the past. So when you see the cement sector and its adoption of fly ash as a raw material, it didn't come as a government mandate to begin with. It didn't come as a regulatory change from somewhere in the world. It started with presumably one factory manager trying something out, and then others in his or her company absorbing it, and then other companies wondering why this company was getting better margins, and then following suit. So that's the kind of three-layer thing that you want to enforce. What you also need is for the broader green hydrogen availability to be accelerated. You need to start making those bigger investments in the production of green hydrogen. And the government has looked at incentivizing both manufacturing of green hydrogen as well as the manufacturing of the electrolyzers that go into it. So that's a good start. A mission mode is always helpful, and raising the profile of the mission to something that is amongst the, I don't know, top 10, top 20 priorities of the government from an energy point of view, certainly will help a long way.
I was thinking about some of the success that we have seen in other areas, which perhaps we can use as a learning in the case of hydrogen. So we have seen India has, it has an edge in frugal engineering, as we've seen it in the space program. Do you think that the same cost efficiency can be applied to hydrogen as well, making India a hub for hydrogen innovation?
Yes, in terms of can India be the hub for hydrogen innovation, and I'll tell you one reason why I think that is both possible and imperative. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which was the big climate bill, for various reasons it got called something else, had an incentive on the consumption of hydrogen. So remember, we were talking about $4-5 needs to come to one, the difference being roughly $3. There was a $3 a kilo consumption incentive. Now, the way the US was looking at it is, if I get demand suitably high, I will get a supply to address that. India doesn't have the fiscal space to provide that kind of incentive. And US industry doesn't have the incentive to bring the price down because they're getting a consumption incentive. So what's in it for the manufacturers to really bring down that cost? Who therefore across the world is going to be looking at how do I bring this down through hardcore investments in research and development and technology innovations? It's going to be countries like India, where you have the ecosystem in place. It's very encouraging when you see so many companies with green hydrogen ambitions. I wish that with each of their green hydrogen ambitions, they have an ambition to invest more in the R&D side of it, both on the cost front as well as on the safety front from an environmental point of view. With both of these, I see no reason why India shouldn't become a global hub for hydrogen innovation. And that really is part of the attractiveness to the Indian government of green hydrogen, where the starting point being one of our inputs is renewables and our costs are already low. So we could produce green hydrogen so much more cost effectively than many other countries which maybe have much higher renewable energy costs. And there doesn't seem to be on the horizon a pathway for those countries to bring down the costs of renewables. And so your input fuel, in the sense, is always going to be expensive in those nations. India can and should do it. But India also needs to move fast on it because there are massive investments being made by so many other countries on green hydrogen. It's great to see the progress made so far, but sticking to your transport analogy, the foot needs to be on the accelerator in terms of innovation.
Since hydrogen is also becoming a globally traded commodity, and transportation cost of course is a challenge, do you think we have any lessons that we can draw from international initiatives? Perhaps the one that comes to my mind is the European hydrogen backbone.
So there's two lessons that can be learned from international examples. One is, for example, the point that you made, the European hydrogen backbone. It's essentially a network of, I think, roughly 40,000 kilometers of connecting renewable sources with hydrogen manufacturing, with green hydrogen manufacturing, and with industrial consumers mostly. And I think they've also got some hubs where they're concentrating this in Europe. I think they call it valleys, hydrogen valleys, if I'm not mistaken. The US has been looking at creation of these hydrogen hubs. So there is a case for looking at that connecting network that connects renewable source with hydrogen, green hydrogen production with the end consumer or the end customer, being the factory or whatever. That's certainly one aspect of it. The second one is, if we are able to adequately address the question of leakages, there's no reason why India cannot be exporting it to nations which either don't have that competitive cost in renewables, for example, Japan. Japan's going to emerge as one of the bigger importers of green hydrogen because the costs of renewables are as high as they are. We have a close strategic relationship with Japan, does India, or other nations which either don't have enough of renewable manufacturing, renewable generation, incremental capacity right now because whatever they've got, they're already using, or their scale up is such that they're not able to get that incremental capacity for green hydrogen. Or there could be other constraining factors as well, capital being most notable for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa to really scale up their renewable story and therefore a green hydrogen story. So yes, India can, and again, that is one of those things where India is looking at green hydrogen and looking at the possibility of us being an energy exporter of green hydrogen. Again, don't mean to pour water on the party, but with the caveats of measuring the leakages part of it. India can and should. And the other very valid point that you made about water usage, India can and should be looking at potentially exporting green hydrogen.
We were talking about several countries and you gave examples. There is a geopolitical shift that we are seeing. We have seen the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. There is a lot of uncertainties across markets. You spoke about the Inflation Reduction Act. We have seen the US putting several subsidies on hold, under this act. We are also witnessing the industrial cost crisis in the EU. Given this shifting global landscape, how do you see India balancing its domestic energy independence and export aspirations and leveraging our diplomatic and trade partnership to secure a stronger position in the global hydrogen markets?
So I'll extend that to beyond the global hydrogen market, because the points that you were talking about were beyond hydrogen. So it is true that there is significant changes happening in the world, most notably in the US, and there is a rolling back of some climate change policies, or many climate change policies in the US. Um, the reality, though, is no matter what one individual government might choose to do in terms of rolling back climate change policies or initiatives, climate change isn't rolling back. Climate change is there. It isn't slowing down because somebody changed course. The other thing is climate action by so many nations is also not slowing down. Just look at China. They're not going to slow down their electric vehicles boom, or their investments in cleaner technology because of something that's happening in one country. If nothing else, they would see that as an opportunity for them to grab more of a global market share, because one of their potential rivals is now not as committed to a particular new course. The demonstration of the potential of that green economy in China is best exemplified by solar panels, the electric vehicles that are there. BYD is the biggest electric car manufacturer in the world. Even in India, we've seen examples of that. I think it was 1.6 million electric scooters and three-wheelers that were sold last year by India, some of which were exported as well. So there's that bit about the climate change not slowing down, climate action not rolling back. What India does need to do is India needs to have, and I think that's fairly ingrained in the country, an acute realization that as we double the size of our economy, every decade for the next few decades, there's a real risk we will end up doubling emissions. And the truth is that we are a fraction of historical emissions that have caused the climate change problem. We are also a fraction of the per capita emissions compared to most, in fact, all industrialized countries. So there's one way of looking at it to say, hey, let's just get to the levels that everyone else is, and that is one form of equity or justice. The difference is that the emissions will stay here, and our poor, our health infrastructure, our food systems will really struggle to face the inevitable climate shocks. And so the Indian government is looking at, and Amitabh Kant most eloquently describes it as the opportunity for the first major economy to industrialize without carbonizing. That is massive. It's never been done before. And so India should continue with that. There's nothing to suggest that India is slowing down. India, while it's doing this, should also remain an authentic and credible voice for the global south on aspects like climate finance. But it isn't it isn't an either or. You should still make as assertively and as persistently and as consistently as you possibly can the case for climate finance and technology transfer, but while also addressing how do you grow without, how do you decouple growth from emissions for India? In the context of all of this, what does this mean for green hydrogen? It means that India should remain a source of innovation for the world. India has in the past, most notably with digital public infrastructure or the COVID vaccine, been really generous about sharing knowledge, especially with emerging economies, developing economies, and India should continue to do that. The soft power that India generates will be even more valuable than the economic returns that India will get from actions like this.
You just mentioned about climate finance, and while, of course, given that we are also one of the countries who's most vulnerable when it comes to climate change, there is certainly going to be an impact if developed countries are going to pull back from the climate agreements and not perhaps support with the promised financial aid to a great extent addressing the problem that we are facing today, which they are the primary stakeholders responsible for. How do we address the climate finance challenge? Because as much as we talk about scaling up technologies, looking into R&D, everything requires money. So how do we address that? And this government, in question, with respect to the US, is going to be around at least for a couple of more years, and we are not at a point where we can afford any more delays when it comes to climate change. It is not holding back. We are seeing so many disasters across different geographies. How do we address that?
So the cynical view on that is if they haven't done much already, doing a little less isn't really going to make that much of a difference. But let me remove my cynical hat for a moment. Um, when I spoke about this being the most expensive endeavor for that humanity has ever undertaken, and your point about its historical emitters that have caused the problem, any reading of climate justice will tell you that polluters should be paying. The people who are responsible for a problem should be paying in the proportion that they created that problem. One thing that is there about climate change is that it doesn't affect any one country. The fastest heating continent is Europe, by the way. And so everybody knows that you need to address it as globally. You can't do it in any one country. I wish that there is continued understanding built and acceptance of responsibility in the richer, more industrialized countries. Hopefully that will happen, progressively. I don't have an answer to your question, to your point about we don't have the time. We don't have the time, but this thing takes as much time as it does. The other thing which I'm more optimistic about is if you look at any business, any sector in the country over the next decade or couple of decades, we're going to end up doubling the size of that sector. So one statistic that you will often hear is half the buildings that we need aren't yet built. So we're going to basically double the size of our buildings, etc. The difference between a growing economy like India and a more established economy is that you have the opportunity to build the second half that you're growing, to build that greener while simultaneously retrofitting the existing half. It's a different but arguably better challenge than having to retrofit an entire industry, an entire segment. As you are building this out, and if I'm a banker that's financing it or an investment fund, what I would look at is to say, hey, a coal-fired coal-fired steel plant vis-a-vis an electric arc furnace, which currently may be more expensive, but in 5 years' time, one can reasonably argue that the conventional high emission steel plant will struggle to sell steel into a country like Europe, and in 10 years' time might struggle to sell steel in India as well, because the emissions and the manufacturing process make it cost competitive. So, not even climate finance, but regular finance being directed at more greener investments is arguably where you're going to get much more climate finance coming in than some massive largesse that comes from the industrial world, although that is the right thing that they should do now. Does the political economy exist? Difficult to imagine that in the immediate future. Maybe not in the US. In other countries, there's industrial costs, cost of living crises. There's also additional investments that Europe, for example, is making on defense. But one way that this could be done is through more technology transfer. So even if it's not trillions of dollars of funding support, more technology transfer is something that can be done and is likely to be more politically palatable in those geographies.
The right thing to do. Emphasis being on that. I think that's the only way to look at it. Uh, you
Can I
know,
just add one point? It's the right thing to do. It's also the selfish thing to do. If Europe right now is the fastest heating continent, and you're seeing, climate change manifests itself in so many different ways in increasing levels of severity across the planet. So you're not just doing this for yourself. It's a bit like the COVID response, right? When the vaccine came, people didn't just say, I want to vaccinate my population, because you realized that that wasn't going to be good enough.
exactly. Yes.
Um, this is that multiplied by many.
I mean, I can only hope we see that logic and understand that. Um, Not just hydrogen, but since we are talking about hydrogen today, these require specialized expertise, and we are already witnessing a skill gap, especially in the renewable energy sector. What would your recommendations be for bridging this gap of education and skill building programs, so that this doesn't become another sticking point in and then slows down our transition?
Sure. No, it is a really big and almost hidden problem, because when you think about climate action, you tend to assume, rightly so, that the big barriers are policy and technology or finance, and they're all real barriers. But government departments that you go to, companies that you go to, will also tell you we don't have the skill set of folks who understand environmental engineering, energy modeling, sustainability. This isn't an easy thing to fix, but here are some things that can be done about it. One is significantly expand how we are teaching climate change to kids in school and college. So embed that not as a nice to have little, session once, but build that in early so that you're teaching kids from an early stage. The second is that your skills development effort, an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter needs to be trained on what is a greener fix uh, for how they do their things. So because that is what consumers are going to be increasingly wanting over the next few years. So embedding green into the skills development process, significantly increasing the level of all forms of environmental engineering and policy courses that are offered at universities and other institutions. Within companies, there is increasing realization at the top in terms of the importance of climate change. There is growing awareness about it within the employee workforce, but that middle management layer and a huge boost to the executive training that happens to middle managers. Right now, typically what middle management training looks like is strategy development or interpersonal skill, and all of that are important. But sustainability as an integrated layer of middle management training, because everyone needs to have it. Your procurement manager, your factory manager, your supply chain manager, all of these folks will need to understand sustainability. It is going to become one of those defining skills in the next 10, 20 years. So prepare now. I've listed out a whole host of things. I'm not for a moment suggesting any of them are quick fixes or easy to do, but they all need to be done.
Absolutely. And I think to that point, the public-private collaboration is also a key to addressing many of these challenges, and particularly the skill development gap that we are witnessing. Um, what technological or policy breakthroughs do you see as potential game changers for green hydrogen?
Um, I think one big breakthrough will be significantly increased investments in R&D, and so that we can innovate on the cost side, um, and on the resources side in terms of water, as well as the measuring and monitoring. So it is going to need significant investments in R&D. This isn't something that only companies are expected to do. The government, you spoke about public-private partnerships. We have an awesome amount of talent in Indian academic institutions. And then so much of India Energy Week that you spoke about was around, innovations that were running in the broad energy space. We need to bring this ecosystem together. So yeah, the single driver is going to be more R&D.
Right. Finally, closing, this session, I definitely want to touch upon some of the initiatives and efforts that we can take on a very individual level. So if you had to pick just one key action India must take today to particularly, of course, lead the global hydrogen economy, what that would be. And second is one advice or you would give to individuals to be part of this climate action, to be part of this whole sustainability discussions that we are having, and truly be a partner in the energy transition.
Sure. You saved the most complex for last. Let me try and do some justice to it. On the big one, for the country, one looks at the increased energy demand, and therefore what is the supply of cleaner energy, and we absolutely need to be doing that. There needs to be more clean energy there, but we also should look at the consumption of energy, the demand for energy. And I think energy efficiency is one of the areas which is, unfortunately not particularly glamorous, but there is so much opportunity for extracting value from that, whether it is, a more energy efficient, diesel pump for irrigation, or a boiler that a factory is using. As much energy efficiency that you can extract from the system is going to be what India needs to do, because it's not about just doing a linear growth, saying, per unit of our GDP, we will keep using the same levels of energy. One of India's nationally determined contributions, the commitments that we set for ourselves under the Paris Climate Agreement, was around reducing the emission intensity. of the Indian economy, and we've made progress on that. We should stick to that. I spoke about energy efficiency, but emissions intensity and energy efficiency are so closely linked that you should be looking at that area. On individuals and what communities, societies, etc., can do, it is easy to look at climate change and think of it as such a complex problem that you can't do anything about it. And there are many aspects of it that, most aspects of it that we can't do anything about to fix ourselves. But we can make small, small changes. Whenever I despair about climate change, or I talk to somebody who's despairing, I advise them to go to Indore. And the reason why you should go to Indore, and I'll take a couple of minutes to just talk about this, was I used to keep reading in the newspapers about, the cleanest city awards and all. And initially I was a little skeptical. I thought it was like the Filmfare Awards and all. But the first time you visit Indore, it is palpable how there is so little, trash on the streets. You notice segregated dustbins all over the city. You'll notice when the garbage collection van truck comes in the morning, how the person is actually checking before they're dumping in that. Indore has Asia's largest bio-CNG plant. It fuels 400 of the 400 plus, I'm guessing now, 400 of the city buses from the food waste of the city. It's a very impressive plant. The economics are robust. It's a public-private partnership. It's running smoothly. The magic almost, though, is not in the plant. The only way, or the most viable way of having a bio-CNG plant is if you have high-quality raw material. And I remember talking to a person at the plant. He was like, we get gold standard garbage. And the gold standard garbage in this person's definition was households in Indore segregate waste at their doorstep. Not 5%, 10%, 90% of Indore's households segregate. That was the last time. I'm hoping that the statistic has become even better now. And Indore is a small city, but it's not a tiny city. It's 30 lakh population. So if a 30 lakh city can do something like this, it is not an initiative only of the collector or the city authorities who have played a great role in it. It is individuals, families, groups that have all come together and said, this is important and we want to do it and we will do it. Imagine if every resident welfare association adopted that approach. Imagine if every municipality in the country was able to pull this off. It would be transformational and reduce the methane emissions from landfill. That's almost like an added benefit. There's so much more that you can gain. So do individual things in any form of your capacity. Choose whatever it is that you want. Do it. A couple of weeks later, when you're used to that, pick something new up, add that to your repertoire and become an individual green warrior. We want more She Talks Greens. We want more She Does Greens.
I think definitely there's a lot to learn from Indore. This has come up several times on my discussions as well, and maybe there is an idea. Maybe we invite the authorities from Indore and let's do some workshops with different RWAs across Delhi NCR, because truly, I think changing that small habits is not easy. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but it is something that we have to do, and everyone has to do. It cannot be that okay, that person can take care of it. I'm like doing enough. So certainly, I think that is a sentiment change, attitude change that we have to focus on. Thank you so much, Isham, for sharing such useful insights, leaving us with some pointers to think about, some learnings to ponder over. And thank you so much for making the time for breaking down green hydrogen for the layman.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for a most thoughtful conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Green hydrogen is more than just a fuel. It's a pathway to a cleaner, more self-reliant future for India. But scaling it won't be easy. As we push forward, innovation, investment, and policy will be key to making this vision a reality. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe and share. Let's keep the dialogue going because the future of clean energy starts with us. Until next time, stay green and stay curious.